Welcome to the State of Our Faith, a faith commons conversation that we have been having weekly during this time of coronavirus pandemic. And we've been looking at how our faith impacts the way we're responding to events in our society, in our communities, our nation during this challenging period of time. I'm George Mason. I'm joined as always by Rabbi Nancy Kasten and Imam Omar Suleiman. And today we have a special guest, a great friend of ours and of our Faith Commons community. Melissa Rogers is with us. Melissa, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Let me just give a brief introduction to about you. Melissa is formerly the Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Executive Director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. That's a really long title, but a really big job during that period of time. She currently is a visiting professor at Wake Forest University School of Divinity and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we're so grateful to also be able to promote her new book. I think it's important, especially in these days. The book, if I can hold that up just right, is called Faith in American Public Life. And it is, it's pretty much a tour de force. It's a history of the First Amendment and of religious liberty and of the issues from the beginning of our nation to the present time and how they have been adjudicated by our country and by people of faith. And it's a virtual textbook, but covers the ground. And Melissa, good luck with it. And thank you for putting such a tremendous resource in our hands. We're really grateful.
And it's really readable, even for people who, like me, who have a hard time with legal lingo and all of that.
That's right.
Oh, that's great to hear. Thank you so much.
So the setup today is this: religious freedom. It's long been our cherished liberty. It's the so-called first freedom. First Amendment protects it. And yet some Americans are having a difficult time defining it today. And we're defining it differently. And it seems that there are in fact dueling definitions of religious freedom today. And why is this debate so intense among us? I think interfaith and multi-faith organizations like ours are working hard to figure out, how do we maintain the tradition of church-state separation at the same time as we are working together for equity and justice and liberty. And so we turn to you today, Melissa, because you're going to answer all these questions for us, of course. But I think it's even more significant in this week because we've had several episodes that have challenged us in how we should respond. People who are strongly endorsing the actions, say, for instance, of President Trump holding up a Bible in front of St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., others criticizing that. Then there are examples, our own Lieutenant Governor here in Texas, who says that we're really never going to have racial peace and justice until everyone accepts Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. This is an elected official making a very public religious claim of a particular kind, which is excluding others. And then we have a local mayor of the city of Wiley in the Dallas area, suburban city, who has said because of his Christian faith, he would not permit a woman to pray in a public gathering, for instance, a city council meeting or some such thing. And so this is a kind of another form of religious freedom that is being claimed by officials in certain ways, and to oppose them is to discriminate against them is part of their argument. So how do you sort through these things, Melissa? And how do we figure out how to be generous with the religious liberty claims that we make, and also to protect the rights of others at the same time?
Right.
There's a whole lot that you've put on the table, George, and I think a lot of things that are very troubling. So I hope we get to unpack each one of them. But just to get a start on a very basic principle with the Constitution, under our Constitution, there are no second-class faiths. Every faith is to be treated equally under the Constitution by government. But we've seen in the past and continuing today that principle is not always embraced, and indeed thought to be something that is inconsistent with religious freedom by some, because they think that a particular religion, say Christianity, should be treated as a first-class religion and every other religion treated as something else. And I think back to, our imperfect, albeit imperfect founders, but President George Washington talking about in his letter to the Touro Synagogue that we should give to, we should make sure that everyone in our country is able to sit under their own vine and fig tree with none to make them afraid, pulling on that sacred verse from the Bible. So, these are principles that I think at our best we have recognized, that the Constitution says that we can have no second-class faiths in the United States of America, but we still need to work to make sure that people understand that, and that principle is honored in law and in particular cases. Now, the cases that you're mentioning, a variety of things, but I think there's sometimes a confusion about people saying, well, because of my conscience as a government official, then I'm going to impose my religious understanding on other people and control a governmental forum according to my religious beliefs. That is not conscience at all. Conscience rights are about being able to express and practice one faith, and being able to, for example, in some cases withdraw from doing particular things because they violate your conscience, but not to control a governmental forum based on your religious beliefs. So I think that gets us started on sort of unpacking some of the problems that we're seeing.
Hi, Melissa. It's good to see you again. Coming from what's been treated like a second-class faith
Yes.
in America, if even treated like a faith when we're talking about Muslims and the religion of Islam, it's been extremely complicated for Muslims, as it's been for everyone, but specifically, I think, in regards to us, because Muslims do feel often like their religious freedom and their religious liberty is under threat from different political actors. But when you think about the particular anti-Sharia legislation that's taken place around the country, and for the benefit of everyone, Sharia to us is the equivalent of halakha for practicing Orthodox Jews or different denominations of Judaism. To different extents, people obviously practice different parts of Sharia law. It spans our personal lives, our family lives, and things of that sort. And so to criminalize Sharia literally would mean we can't pray anymore. Not just can't pray in public, we just can't pray anymore. And we can't have halal meat because that's part of observing Sharia for us, observing our faith. And so when you have over 30 states that have passed anti-Sharia legislation in the name of this idea that Muslims have secretly infiltrated government and are plotting a takeover, which would require over 30 states to overthrow or to write anti-Sharia legislation to prevent the overthrow of government by Barack Obama, who of course was not just a Muslim, but a member of the Muslim Brotherhood as well, according to many of those sites in those corners. But for Muslims, it's been very difficult to really understand where we fit in all of this, and the way that we've been excluded from religious liberty claims, while at the same time feeling like we really don't have a political home. So if you could talk a little bit about the way that religious liberty, claims of religious liberty, have been manipulated and have forcefully excluded some, and what does religious liberty for a quote unquote second-class faith that's been deemed a second-class faith, right? What does that look like for Muslims and Jews and Sikhs and different faith groups in this country?
Yeah, it's very troubling, and I'm glad that you raise it, because we see at work a double standard here often, where some people would say that observing Sharia is something that it's not, and thus leading to these anti-Sharia laws, and at the same time work in their own ways to try to say that biblical law should be imposed on all Americans, by government. So we see obviously a disconnect there, and a painful one that needs to be pointed out. I think that some of the things we need to be aware of when we talk about manipulation of religious freedom are certainly when we're ignoring facts to the contrary. And unfortunately, I have to say that President Trump has been an example of each of these factors that I'm going to name, when he is lifted up and calls himself a champion of religious freedom. Yet he was the one who called for people to be banned from our country simply because of their faith affiliation. There's no way that someone who calls for that can be a champion of religious freedom. We also have to look for a selective approach to free exercise issues. So free exercise for some their free exercise claims are immediately granted. But other people's free exercise claims, whether they come from a different faith or simply would challenge a given administration's agenda with their faith, then their free exercise claims are rejected and treated very differently. Another obvious point is preference for some faiths over others. We saw in some early days that President Trump was talking about preferring Christian refugees over refugees of other faiths, concerns about running roughshod over the rights of others in the name of religious freedom, whether it is, rights of LGBTQ people or other types of situations. That's a concern. We have to balance rights of religious freedom with other human rights, and also a concern about appropriation of sacred symbols. Especially while acting contrary to the faith that's being claimed. So when we saw President Trump this week clearing out peaceful protesters with pepper balls and smoke canisters, and indeed removing a priest from church property with police and military personnel so that he could then walk over and hold up a Bible, silently waving it. We see, I think, there, and through some of his other actions, an attempt to appropriate sacred symbols while desecrating religious teachings associating with that symbol to create what you might call a kind of faux faith that serves him. And to me, that's tremendously troubling and a huge warning sign. And let me just quickly add that, the things that I'm criticizing about President Trump, I think are all important to recognize. I should say at the same time that I have never seen another president in my lifetime do all these things in this very dangerous mix. So I think all presidents in my lifetime have, and none have been perfect, but have sought to bring people together across faiths and beliefs. And so I think what we're seeing in President Trump is something different than all previous presidents that we've seen, at least in my lifetime.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about that as it applies to his appointment of federal judges? Because, during his administration, President Trump has appointed over 30% of the federal circuit court judges in this country. And of course, he has his Supreme Court appointees as well. And as he is, using religion as a political, wedge issue, he is also remaking the courts in a certain way. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think what we've seen most prominently are his appointments to the Supreme Court. Let me just focus on that for a minute. He's appointed Justices Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh, and we have yet to see how they will interpret the religion clauses of the First Amendment in many instances. But I think one of the things that I've been troubled by already is Justice Gorsuch, for example, in a case last term involving a 32-foot cross that was a World War I memorial on government property. The court in the end said that symbol could stand for a variety of reasons, including its historical meaning. Gorsuch went farther with Justice Thomas and said not only could that cross stand, but there would be no problem with, or no legal or constitutional problem with today governments, putting up similar symbols. So, when I heard that, I thought about, what about the United States government putting up a 32-foot cross on the National Mall to commemorate the war dead in Afghanistan and Iraq? Well, first of all, I think it would be obvious that that symbol would not feel to non-Christians to be honoring the war dead that were their family members who were not Christian. And then perhaps less obviously, by taking the cross, which is of course the symbol to Christians of Jesus Christ's sacrifice and resurrection and biblical promises of eternal life, to turn that into a symbol of our country and of the sacrifice that people make in wars, is to nationalize the preeminent symbol of Christianity and change and distort its meaning. So I just offer that as one example of some things I'm concerned about.
Right. Well, so that speaks to the question of norms and, the differences between laws and norms. And I wonder how some of the norms that we have just, integrated into American life, like praying before public events at things like city council meetings or at sports events or at meetings of various kinds and gatherings and political gatherings even, how have these things that have become norms, although I don't think they were always norms in our country, but how have they contributed to this kind of erosion of the separation between the wall of separation between church and state? And, do we need to start, like in groups like ours, which are multi-faith groups who want to honor everyone's faith, are we actually maybe contributing to this erosion of that wall by ascribing good faith to everyone who's participating and who's listening?
Well, it's a good question. And I certainly was disturbed by the example that you raised. I believe it was the mayor of Wiley that you said was, using his power as a government official to try to screen out women from praying before the Synod Council. And you have to ask, well, where does that go? Where does it end? I mean, what if, he doesn't like the prayers of certain religious traditions? Are those going to be excluded too? I mean, it's all very troubling. And I think it's important that we're doing, having this conversation today to say that that is not appropriate, not in line with certainly the spirit, if not the letter of the Constitution. And I think there has been some pressure brought to bear on him, and that's appropriate. I don't expect that the precedents upholding legislative prayer, as in part because of their historical background, are going to be overturned. But I think it is worthwhile thinking about how we're participating in those practices, if we are, and be mindful of the fact that there are alternatives to, having government sanctioned prayer before council meetings, which could include moments of silence, or also could include gatherings that are unofficial in nature of legislators or city council members and others who want to just meet in their offices or outside before a meeting for a word in their own tradition. So it's important to keep all those things in mind, I think.
Yeah, and I think it begs the question of, why do we have these prayers in the first place? I mean, is it for the person who's praying to exhibit their strongly held religious conviction, or is it in order to try to bring God's presence into the meeting in some way? I think that we started out thinking it would be the latter when the law was going in favor of opening up these spaces for faith and spirituality. But I think maybe now it's, the pendulum has swung in the other direction, and people feel like they have to be true to their own particular religious tradition when they're praying.
Right. And there, I think that it is a good thing to think about. I think that the opinions from the court talk about, including the most recent one on legislative prayer, talk about a need for a kind of hands-off approach by legislative people or city council members once they say that prayers can happen, then they need to take a kind of hands-off approach to their content. Well, that doesn't seem to be what this city council member was doing. So that's one issue I think that needs to be explored. And then also talk about, what does conscience mean and not mean? Conscience, should mean an ability to follow, one's own religious beliefs or non-religious beliefs in certain respects, but it shouldn't mean blocking other people from living their lives, and certainly not blocking them from participating in a government forum.
If I can jump in here, so it's interesting because when President Trump signed that recent legislation to protect prayer in school, he had a young hijabi Muslim girl right behind him. And that was probably the first time in a few years that I saw something praising Trump circulating through Muslim groups just for the presence of that Muslim girl. And I think that it's important to also recognize the significance, to those minority faith groups when they see their faith exhibited in those spaces. Then it offers a sense of validation and affirmation that you're not excluded, right? So like every time an imam gives an opening prayer at a city council chamber, like it means something to the community because of, I think, the attack and the particular attack of trying to strip Islam of its religion status, right, in this space. And so I almost wonder, I mean, there are two things that come to my mind. One of them is that when Muslims hear the thought of the elimination of prayer in the public space, they're thinking about, does that mean I'm going to have to worry about praying my 5 prayers in school anymore? Are classrooms, will the school still accommodate me to sneak off at lunch and pray in the corner? Will I still be able to have that accommodation at work? Will I still be, I mean, some of the Black Lives Matters protests that have been taking place around the country, some of the most powerful scenes have been Muslims sort of honoring their 5 daily prayers. So when they hear that, it's like, uh-oh,
yes,
is that the next thing that's going to be chipped away at? And I almost wonder, if there is a way instead to try to make sure that place of prayer celebrates the diversity, recognizing that it's always going to have complications, right? Because if I'm an atheist or an agnostic, it doesn't matter what tradition, the very presence of prayer in those chambers and in those legislative spaces is obviously causing me, could be causing me apprehension.
Right. I'm really glad you raised that. That's a great point. And I think some of the best things we can do with legislative prayer that's official in nature is to try to follow the Supreme Court's guidance on this, which would, lead to, I think, diversity of perspectives and a more hands-off nature on the content of the prayer. But it's important to recognize, as I think we all do, but we need to stress again, and I certainly try to do this in my book, that religion in the public square means much more than whatever the government decides to showcase about religion, like legislative prayer. Religion in the public square includes, George held up the cover of my book, includes the ability, the equal ability of religious groups to speak out in publicly visible places and indeed on government property on a same basis as secular groups. So the front cover of my book has a women clergy protesting right in front of the Department of Homeland Security. And they were able to do that because we have this wonderful First Amendment that says that religious groups have just as much right as secular groups to protest and speak and express themselves on government property. So I think the best kind of religious expression in American public life is one that we can have where it's unmediated by the state, but it is still happening in places that are publicly visible, which would include government property. And I quite agree with you, Omar, that some of the most moving scenes in our recent national public life have been people of faith expressing their faith in the streets of America on behalf of racial justice and on behalf of love and compassion for everyone.
So, Melissa, when you talked about secularism and about Christians wanting to assert their voices in the public square and on public property and the like, government property, in fact, I think it's important for us to pause and realize that when I hear Christians complaining about the culture generally, and celebrating these advances in their mind that have preferenced Christians through government appointments and through symbolic acts of people asserting their Christian privilege in public. What's at the heart of that is a concern on two sides. One is secularism. That is to say, they often feel like the country used to be friendlier to their Christian faith, that they could practice it more freely without being criticized for doing so. And then you have rulings taking prayer out of the public schools, official prayer, teacher-led prayer, government-authorized prayer. But nonetheless, it feels like another loss. Crosses, creches, all these sorts of things, not permitted, not permitted, not permitted. So they feel as though there's encroaching secularism that is discriminating against what used to be for them something natural and public and free. And they then complain that they are the only ones really being criticized for practicing their faith in public. We never see, in other words, a Muslim being so criticized. Of course we do, but a Jew being so criticized, of course we do. But nonetheless, there is on the other side this sort of fear of pluralism.
Yeah.
That if we make open space for everyone, then again, we're getting squeezed by the secularists and by the pluralists, and what space is left for Christian expression? And into that, what we have is Christian nationalism, right? Defining, so the way to handle that is to define Christianity and the country as really being intimately knit. And the most extreme version of that, of course, is called dominionism, something Nancy is often reminding me is going on right under the surface of things. George, please open your eyes to this and realize this. That is, a group of people who believe that there are 7 pillars of society that all have to be dominated by a man at the top that is a Christian man in order for God to bless the country. And we end up with a theocracy. And this is happening even in this effort in the middle here. So how do you speak to more conservative Christians who feel this sense that they are losing their place in society, and the only way for them to feel free is to celebrate these victories, whether in the courts or in local public life?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I appreciate your attempt to, sympathetically understand what people are feeling. I think that it's really important for us to say yes to many things about religion and public life, because that's what the Constitution promises as well, that there are so many ways to pray in public school while still ensuring that school-sponsored prayer doesn't happen. So students can pray over their lunch. They can meet in Bible clubs after school if they're secondary public school students on the same basis. They can meet on school property on the same basis that other extracurricular clubs meet. They can reflect their religious beliefs, whatever they are, in their homework assignments, as long as it's appropriate. We need to, as my friend Charles Haynes often says, say yes to as many things, at least, as we have to say no to make clear that this is not an attempt. It would be unconstitutional to try to squelch religion out of our nation's public life. That would be, I think, both wrong, that would be unconstitutional and wrong. And counterproductive. So can we make it clear to people that there are all these opportunities to express one's faith? And if I can say, I think my book lays out a ton of them.
Yes, it does.
And so I hope people who have these questions will read it. And I think we also need to be on guard. Thank you, George. That we don't, turn around and express bias against Christians. That's wrong
Right.
too.
Right.
It's absolutely wrong.
Absolutely.
To reflect.
But I do want to bring up the fact that we do have a kind of what we've now called a secular Christianity that is accepted virtually by everyone in this country, right? So for example, our religious holidays are Christian holidays. And, we've had a conversation in this, because we close our program with a prayer every week about, so many public prayers end in, in Jesus's name, which is an exclusionary, it feels exclusionary to a lot of people. Now, there are a lot of people who are not bothered by the fact that Christmas is the holiday, or that a prayer ends in Jesus's name. They can translate it. They feel included. They don't feel excluded by that, but many do. And when that is always the deferral to the Christian majority, which it is a majority, then that creates a kind of imbalance and a barrier to really getting to the other issues of religious freedom that we face.
Right. It's a good point, Nancy. And I think once we begin to have eyes to see it and ears to hear it, we can, as Christians, and I'm Baptist like George, see that many times our religious practices are already accommodated in the baseline law and policy, although not explicitly so, perhaps. So when others come and say, wait, I see that there's embedded in here an accommodation of Christian belief, but not my religious beliefs, which are Jewish or Muslim or whatever, then I think we can begin to have a better understanding of why we need to accommodate those other claims. And I do think that, at least I'm always hopeful, and I'm hopeful today, that as the nation is confronting some hard truths about our system of racial equality or lack thereof, and so many things there, can we also confront some other hard truths in the process that may have privileged our own Christianity over other faiths by law or by other governmental action, and work to do better? And can we certainly at the minimum, hold our government officials accountable when they would fearmonger on the basis of religion, race, or ethnicity, for example? Can we stand up together? Can we all agree, and I think we should be able to all agree, that that has no place in the United States of America for a government official to engage in such fearmongering and hold people accountable? So I'm hopeful that maybe at this time where we're really doing some serious reflection, that we can reflect on these matters too.
I hate to be the timekeeper here. Omar, I'm sorry, we've sort of gone past the half hour. And this is, with Melissa and all of us, we think we could just go on for hours with this. And we would love to have you back, and we will. Because
we were going to have Melissa come in person to Dallas for a Faith Commons program before all this coronavirus stuff hit. You'll be first up when things open up again.
I will look forward to it.
It's a fascinating
And I appreciate, let me say again, how much I appreciate the way in which you three are working together. It's really inspiring. And I look forward to following your work in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Omar, would you model for us how we can pray for one another and for our country and community?
First, we've got to all get to a sink and, do the ablution. Muhammad Ali's 1979 Doing the Islamic Prayer was just released a few days ago. His daughter, Hana Ali, released, I think it's a 15-minute clip of him practicing an Islamic prayer. It's really beautiful. So I'll make sure that I'll pray in a way that we can all stick together and we can all feel included, God willing. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, we call upon you in these troubling times to comfort those that have been hurt and who are taking to the streets or taking to their prayers or taking to their screens to express the pain that they felt at long-standing injustices in this country that have not been rectified. We ask you to comfort them. We ask you to hear their calls. We ask you to activate us towards them and for them so that we uplift all of those that are hurting and all of those that are in pain. We ask you to use us for the causes of righteousness and good and comfort and mercy. We ask you to fill our hearts with the tranquility and the clarity that is necessary to be able to then transfer that to the world around us and to lead us to a better place as an entire collective, as a humanity. We ask you to bring about harmony in our society, not in a way that ignores the injustices that have made it impossible thus far, but in a way that finally rectifies those injustices. We ask you to allow us to differ with grace always and to unite in love always. We ask you to forgive us for our shortcomings towards you and towards one another. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.